We're continuing with our Chapter 11, Regional Studies of Southeast Asia. This is Lecture 2 for Chapter 11, and here we'll talk about the culture and economics of the entire region in general. First, we'll discuss the religious characteristics of the region. Let's start with peninsular Southeast Asia. We see that the largest portion is Buddhist, very strong influence from both the south and from the north in terms of having Buddhist religions. They tend to have a more unique Buddhist religion to that of China or Japan. The northern region of Vietnam has Buddhism more characteristic of the Chinese belief system. You notice a number of regions of indigenous religious beliefs. Notice how these correspond to the more mountainous regions between the valleys running north and south. These regions also run north and south, and these are ethnic groups that continue to maintain a more indigenous religious belief. Also, we see indigenous beliefs within the interior of the island of Borneo, the entire western section of New Guinea, and we move on to some of the other characteristics. Malaysia and Indonesia are two of the largest Islamic religion beliefs in the world. Some of the largest numbers of Islamic people live in this region. There are some pockets of Christianity in some of the old historic port cities related to European colonization, East Timor, parts of Indonesia in particular. And as we look to the Philippines was colonized initially by the Spanish, and as such adopted the Christian Catholic religion during that period. Philippines is a very strongly Catholic region today, due to that Spanish influence during the colonial periods from around 1800 to 1940s. One more, forgot, the small island of Bali here in Indonesia as well is a small region of remnants of Hinduism that's related to the Sriwijaya theocracy that existed early on in this region. It's the only real remnant of that Hindu period. Colonially, we can speak of two time periods. The mercantile colonialistic period from about 1500 to 1800, and industrial colonialism from 1800 to 1945. The mercantile period was an exchange mostly of raw materials, although that even continued into the industrial colonialistic period. But there was trade in a number of varieties of goods, more of an extension of an older period where a lot of agricultural commodities were traded. We move into the industrial colonialism period. There were small industries, labor-intensive industries that required large amount of manpower, and trade was often either locally by the colonizers or exchanged internationally through the colonizers' transportation systems. These two periods actually contributed very strongly to what still exists as a core peripheral exchange. The colonialists' primary harbors and economic centers became the core of economic activity and controlled the importing and exporting of goods outside of each of these countries, but also created an interior core periphery exchange where they managed the exchange of the raw materials to, especially during the industrial period, imported, if you would not call it importing, moving raw materials from the more remote parts of a country to the industrial complex zones, doing the manufacturing, generating the wealth, but not redistributing the wealth in infrastructure investments or in education or healthcare to the peripheral resource extraction regions. During this long period, the Chinese middlemen left an important mark on the region. They left China for various reasons, such as civil wars or better markets, and spread throughout the region, working in inter-island shipping, making their work critical to colonial trade. Their presence became significant as early as the 14th century. Their populations dramatically increased when trading, agriculture, and mining activities expanded during the early colonial period. The civil wars in China were an added inducement for many Chinese to migrate and seek opportunities in coastal Southeast Asia. During the late colonial period, the flow of Chinese reached its highest level, and by the end of World War II, approximately 10 million Chinese resided in Southeast Asia, with the greatest concentrations in Thailand and Malaysia. Most arrived as desperately poor plantation contract laborers. Over time, many opened small retail shops and trading concerns, while others engaged in inter-island shipping or worked as clerks in Chinese and European-owned companies. Overseas Chinese became indispensable to the success of Western-based industrial colonialism, and hence were referred to by the term middlemen because they often controlled the retail trade of imported Western consumer products. Eventually, some became captains of industry, banking, insurance, shipping, and corporate agri-processing empires that competed with European firms and accounted for a significant share of East Asian or Southeast Asian capital investment just prior to World War II. Overseas Chinese continue to play a prominent economic role in many Southeastern Asian countries. Their economic impact is strongest in Singapore, in Malaysia, and Thailand. These are the places where ethnic Chinese constitute very large percentages of the population, especially in Singapore with almost 75% of the population. Even countries with smaller Chinese populations, their numbers belie their economic strength. In Indonesia, ethnic Chinese in 2010 only comprised less than 4% of the population, but held significant economic power in village, regional, and even at national scales. Pre-colonial states of Southeast Asia. We see that the green designate core areas of population before 1500 AD, and then the area of the sea state of Srivijaya around 1100 AD, with other important trading centers within these core areas listed on this map as well. This map is on page 509 of your text. At first glance, we see in peninsular Southeast Asia a very direct correspondence of these core areas on the river systems, the early population section, and still today the highest densities of populations are in these same areas. These are the river delta regions close to the coast of the Red River, the Mekong River, the Chao Phraya, and the Irrawaddy River systems. These were mostly agricultural settlements, the same for the Red River. However, the Champa region was really more of a sea trading society and did not engage in large amounts of agriculture. That's especially true for Srivijaya. It was also a trading area. The power of the state rested on taxing rural production in the agricultural regions, where alluvial lands could be transformed from forest and freshwater swamp environments into productive rice-growing regions. The power of the state rested on taxing the rural population to finance defense, trade, and irrigation. Mainland Southeast Asian cores emerged only after adopting Indian models of state organization based on kinship, the court, secular and religious bureaucracies, and a royal and sacred capital. Insular Southeast Asia, many small kingdoms dotted the regional coastlines. The Indianized and Buddhist kingdom of Srivijaya flourished from the 7th to the 14th centuries with its capital in Palembang, which is right here, in a freshwater swamp region of southeastern Sumatra, in present-day Indonesia. Srivijaya was a thalassocracy, a sea-based state. Like many other smaller maritime states in the region, its power was derived from long-distance maritime trade that flowed into and out of the capital. Little reliance was placed on agriculture. Another pre-European insular core area was a group of successive Indianized states that first emerged during the early centuries AD on the island of Java. The earliest of these was a Hindu-Buddhist states occupied the small fertile valleys of central and eastern Java, where, much like the mainland riverine states, they gained political control by taxing the rural economic activity. During the 15th and 16th centuries, arrivals of Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders dramatically transformed the development of insular Southeast Asia. Indian merchants introduced Islam, which was adopted by local royalty, who became leaders or sultanates. Islam subsequently spread rapidly through the local population and even reached into the southern Philippines. The main exceptions to the adoption of Islam were the more isolated interior people and the island of Bali that remained Hindu. Malacca, right here, was very similar to Srivijaya, a very important trade site. The Strait of Malacca today is an extremely important transportation trade route for sea ships. Malacca was very much like modern-day Singapore is today here on the south end of the peninsula. A lot of similarities in terms of economic activity. Luxury items traded during this time included nutmeg, cloves, mace, pepper, and gold, in addition to aromatic woods. Traders visited these successful kingdoms from all over the world as they traveled through this region. The pre-European empires, the economic, political, and cultural cores are the result of a reemergence of Hinduism and Buddhism. There are monumental ruins at Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat that stand as testimony to the agricultural productivity and trade capabilities of the pre-European economy. And of course, Srivijaya, southeastern Sumatra, a thalassocracy, which refers to a state with a primarily maritime realms or an empire at sea. The colonial period ended sort of during and after the Second World War. The European colonialists were routed very thoroughly by the Japanese due to their large number and left the region at the start of the Second World War. After the defeat of the Japanese retreated from much of Southeast Asia, or in fact all of Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia was left to independence. So there are two current urgent needs: to diversify the economy for modern growth in the region and to reduce the dependence on exports of raw materials. Refining of local raw materials is key to both of these needs. Let's take a quick look at the population density map from page 519 in your text. We'll start with the Philippines, a very highly or very densely populated series of islands, agricultural islands, as well as fishing as a resource extraction method. We see, with the exception of the capital, which is very highly density, very high population density region. This is very typical of the core peripheral example in the Philippines. That's also very prominent in Indonesia for the island of Java and the rest of Indonesia. The island of Java has the highest population as well for Indonesia, and the islands of Indonesia then serve as a peripheral region for resource extraction as well as agricultural production. Malaysia has Kuala Lumpur, a very large city that also acts as kind of the core to the periphery of the rest of Malaysia. Kuala Lumpur is the major industrial region and manufacturing region, as well as shipping site on the Strait of Malacca, near the site of the original city of Malacca itself. Thailand, of course, Bangkok we've talked about as the primate city of Thailand. It's on the delta. It serves as an agricultural port for the agricultural production of Thailand, but also as a major industrial base that produces a wide variety of products. We see the coast of Vietnam, well populated, but not so much the interior of the mountainous regions. And we see the Irrawaddy River region of Myanmar with the densest population there, also in the riverine areas. Much of the more mountainous areas of Borneo and New Guinea have very low population densities. Population rate of natural increase. This map is on page 520 with a good discussion. And if we look at, consider, as we'll talk about very quickly here, the modernizers and reformers, we see mostly the modernizers having the lowest population densities and the reformers having, population of natural increase, and the reformers have the highest rate of natural increase. The reformer countries like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, all share in that they are less developed countries and have the characteristics of less developed economic systems. The same is true for East Timor. It was ravaged during war and occupation with Indonesia, and it has the highest rate of natural increase in the region. The Philippines, also a less developed region, has a very high rate of natural increase as well. When we look at some of the more developed modernizer countries, places like Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, we see a slightly lower population rate of natural increase. Singapore is a highly developed country, as well as Brunei. Both have very low rates of natural increase, much more like a highly developed country. Economics of the modernizers versus the reformers. The modernizers were the first countries in the region to adopt economic policies that promote manufacturing as the engine of development. The modernizing countries were members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. This trade group was established in 1967, which specified manufacturing as the engine of economic growth. Early on, and even into today, it depended on direct foreign investment from the West, But today, much of that direct foreign investment comes from places like China, from South Korea, and especially from Japan. The reformer nations had economic policies tied to socialism and were adverse to external influence. Many of these were countries in the 1970s and 1980s where previously socialist governments that were resistant to that globalization include Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. The countries here that joined ASEAN in the 1990s. Together, all of these countries have formed the ASEAN Free Trade Area, and that was formed in 1992. This economic chart and a discussion of it is on page 515, and we've broken up countries, the modernizing countries and the reformer countries, compared gross national income, PPP, average annual FDI inflows, and Human Development Index from the UN value. And of course, the higher the Human Development Index, the more developed a country is considered. And we see Singapore the highest with a per capita income of almost $60,000 a year. Brunei is next, Malaysia, quite a bit less than those two leading countries. Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines round out the modernizing countries. Singapore has a huge FDI inflow. Brunei, of course, is very small and a rich kingdom, has relatively less, and most of that is based on oil. Malaysia has very high FDI. Indonesia does as well. Philippines, not as much. We see that the reformers have much lower per capita income, and generally, with the exception of Vietnam, that has been a rapid reformer, much lower foreign direct investments in recent beginning of this century. Myanmar in particular is very low, as well as Cambodia. And their human development indexes are noticeably lower than the most developed of the modernizer countries. Urban versus rural transformations. Mega cities in the region include Jakarta, Manila in the Philippines, the capital, and Bangkok in Thailand. These places and other larger cities in the regions are known as Extended Metropolitan Regions, or EMRs. Their core inner regions and outer zones comprise a larger urban area connected by corridors of transportation that often are highly urbanized or mixed urbanized and rural populations. The growth of these regions are fueled by FDI, but it really raises the question of, is the outer zone truly urban when it contains such a strong mix of both rural and urban characteristics? This stylized theoretical diagram of an EMR is discussed on page 515. Extended metropolitan regions are megacities that include a core, a major city, an inner region, the peri-urban region, and the outer zones, the desicotas, and densely populated rural regions in a larger urban area. Indicative of the EMR landscape, Indonesian term desicota is a compound word combining desa, or village, and kota, city. The inclusion of this outer zone as part of the EMR, which often extends 50 miles from the urban core, is justified because while the land is primarily agricultural, factories dot the landscape. A network allows for high mobility. Partially explaining the growth of EMRs is the over-concentration of FDI in assembly manufacturing as these cities become production platforms that are integrated into the global economy. Well, that's it for Lecture 2 on Chapter 11, and now I'll talk to you again soon.